RoboCop is great. What are you really sacrificing in the name of progress?
Stay out of trouble.
That film, to me, is a triumph of Paul Verhoeven.
The robo-suit. We're sitting there going, oh my God. They literally had to assemble him like he was a little toy, put him together with a screwdriver.
And every time I started feeling sorry for myself, I just looked at Peter.
He was so frustrated. A lot of moments where basically we found solutions on the set.
They got it down to about 3 or 4 hours.
Humor, a slap in the face of society, and a great reversal at the end. It's a one-off, man.
I'd buy that for $1.
Serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law.
There's a new guy in town. His name's RoboCop.
Robin! Thank you for your cooperation. Let the woman go. You are under arrest.
You have 20 seconds to comply.
Murphy, it's you.
You are simply a machine. I am a machine.
Hey, it's RoboCop.
That fucking gun!
Thank you for your cooperation.
Reed!
Yeah.
He needs a car.
Sure. Anytime.
Oh, yeah. Go get him, boy.
Thank you. Come quietly or there will be trouble.
I give you RoboCop 2.
This is Media Break. You give us 3 minutes, and we'll give you the world.
Somewhere there is a crime happening. Stay out of trouble.
We have a warrant out for the arrest of RoboCop.
Nice shooting, son. What's your name?
RoboCop.
Video games based on movies was all the rage in the 80s and 90s, but nowadays enjoying the latest titles based on your favourite movie seems to be very limited, with most licensed games finding themselves on mobile devices. But back in the day you could expect to find a video game based on the latest summer blockbuster finding its way to your home computer or console. In the early 1980s they had varying degrees of success. Titles such as Star Wars, Tron and Krull did well in the arcades, but the most disastrous was E.T. on the Atari 2600, doing major damage to the US gaming market. But across the pond, the UK had not faced the same fate, and games company Ocean Software were finding success with titles such as Daley Thompson's Decathlon, The Neverending Story, Street Hawk, Rambo, Short Circuit and Cobra. These games sold well just based on the title alone. Some may have been utter rubbish, but Ocean Software saw a market to dominate as a leader in licensed video games. The software manager at Ocean, Gary Bracey, was intrigued by the script to an upcoming movie called RoboCop. He read the script and it just seemed to resonate with him. The film could have turned out to be a straight-up B-movie, and with not much star power behind the project, it was seen as a leap of faith to invest in. With the rights acquired for a mere $20,000, Ocean was sent production stills and eventually VHS tapes containing short scenes to help them translate the film into a game. Soon after the deal was struck, game developer Data East sought to sub-license the title from Ocean in order to create its own arcade and pinball machine, and Ocean would then go on to port the arcade game to the micro home computers. Gary Bracey said that Orion Pictures weren't that protective over their intellectual property, as Warner Brothers would be with Batman the following year. Data East would get the chance to visit the set, so they would do a lot of the legwork, so Ocean didn't need that much reference material. RoboCop turned out to be a sleeper hit of 1987. Produced for a small budget of $13 million, it would gross $53 million in the USA alone, so Ocean knew there would be a strong appetite for a video game. Even though Ocean were basing their versions on the arcade, they wanted their home ports to be different from the coin-up. They came up with the idea of incorporating some extra scenes to make the 8-bit micro and 16-bit computer games unique. For example, the photo fit and hostage scenes that occasionally separate the run and gun action template laid down by Data East's arcade machine. This formula would become a familiar trait of Ocean's future titles. The first home versions were for the 8-bit micros, with the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad. There was versions for DOS and Apple II that year, but those were a bit more obscure. The Amiga and Atari St versions would arrive in 1989, then the NES and Game Boy versions. Everyone at Ocean knew they had a surefire hit on their hands. Coding duties on the Spectrum machine were handled by Mike Lamb, veteran of titles such as the acclaimed arcade conversion of Renegade, and another licensed title, Top Gun. And John Megan would be the lead coder for the C64. The programmers faced issues around the clock with the restrictive nature of the hardware, running out of memory and producing a balanced and fun game. Ocean lavished a huge glossy box on RoboCop, capturing the film's theatrical poster, and enforced a heavy advertising campaign. The game was released in time for Christmas 1988, just as the UK VHS video release was flying off the shelves at both rental and retail stores. Ocean even produced a commercial that would be included on the VHS tape. The game would be a massive hit, especially on the ZX Spectrum, and stuck in the games chart for 18 months. So what are the games like for each format?
RoboCop.
With the arcade game being first out of the gate, this would be the most familiar to gamers throughout the world. Its attract screen would play out the story of how Murphy became RoboCop. The game would take sound samples from the movie and make use of the film's theme tune. A straightforward platform shooter, with Robo walking from left to right, and has the ability to punch, jump, use his famous gun, and pick up additional power-ups. After defeating Ed 209 at the end of the first stage, the difficulty is ramped up considerably to eat up your spare change, and you will quickly find yourself dying every few minutes. Data East would recycle Ed 209 multiple times throughout the game, in different sizes and colours. The levels do begin to deviate quite a bit from the film, as Data East gets a bit too creative and not in a good way. The game's engine does buckle under the pressure of too many sprites on screen, and it does go full slow-mo.
Thank you for your cooperation.
The ZX Spectrum and Amstrad versions would share the similar code. The Specky release would end up being the most popular of the versions produced. The game was known for its limited colour palette, with the game mostly in monochrome, with some bits of colour at the bottom of the screen, with the added awesome loading screen drawn by Bill Harbison, capturing the film's poster. The game also took away Robocop's ability to jump. It has great music included by Jonathan Dunn that would become a familiar theme of the 8-bit versions. If mastered, you could complete it in about 15 minutes. But if you're a bit out of touch, it can be pretty tough, like most of the old 8-bit micro games. Gamers loved a challenge back in the day, so revisiting some old classics you forget how tough they were. The Spectrum and Amstrad versions have some nice visual details, especially in the backgrounds, having Dick Jones feature as you confront Ed 209, and like the film, you have to take him on with your fists. The Amstrad version would take advantage of the computer's expanded colour palette, so you end up with a more visually pleasing title. The Commodore 64 version was the first game I played on the home computer. Smooth frame rate, Robocop could jump like the arcade version, it had great music and a cracking loading screen, but it couldn't be completed due to a major game-breaking bug, as it was released unfinished. So they decided to give you a limited amount of time on the drug factory level, so you can never get to the end. There was a way to glitch through a wall to complete the level, but after the following stage, all the graphics are corrupt. A fan managed to fix the game in 2015, but it's pretty shocking Ocean put this out, and the game magazines didn't call them out for it, and still gave it glowing reviews, and it sold extremely well. The DOS versions tried to follow the look of the arcade, but it's jerky, exhibits poor scrolling of the screen, and has limited colours on display. The graphics are detailed in areas, but it's not a lot of fun to play, and Ed 209 looks very strange when you come to fight him. His head has appeared to have shrunk. The Apple II port was handled by Interactive Designs, and again tries to copy the arcade, but looks blocky and plays poorly. These versions are best avoided. Kicking off 1989, there was a port to the MSX, which looks identical to the Spectrum release, though its performance is a tad more sluggish. Fans of RoboCop who had updated their 8-bit computers to the 16-bit Amiga and Atari St got new ports which tried to replicate the arcade by Data East. They looked a lot more flashy compared to their 8-bit counterparts. These ports have minor changes with the inclusion of the media break to kickstart the game. It keeps the shooting gallery but adds to face-matching minigames and hostage rescue sequences. The frame rate is not very smooth and has a large border around the screen restricting the action. Both the Amiga and Atari St versions look pretty much the same, but the ST game lacks speech in areas and the sound effects aren't quite as effective. The Nintendo version follows in the footsteps of the other games, but mixes up the gameplay with RoboCop only using his gun on certain sections of a level. He would often put his gun away and you would have to use your fists to take on your enemies, which made it a bit frustrating. The enemies would often run at you unarmed, probably in an attempt to make it more kid-friendly to appease Nintendo, though in some cases you do get to shoot dogs. You have a number of the levels expanding with multiple rooms and have mini-bosses, who you have to take on in a punch-up, which requires some good timing to take them out. Ed 209 appears a couple of times throughout the game like the arcade version, and it's like he is the size of a house. Data East did thankfully add story elements between each level with some cool cutscenes. It does include the RoboCop theme tune, but it plays on a loop throughout the entire game, and you will get tired of it very quickly. The Game Boy version will be the last of the RoboCop games based on the original film, and the theme tune composed by Jonathan Dunn for these 8-bit micro games would get used by Ariston for one of their commercials in the early 90s, with the Game Boy theme tune being the one that was sampled. The tune even made the list of Charlie Brooker's Desert Island discs. The Game Boy version follows the roots of the Spectrum game, looking very similar, but lacks detail in areas. It does give Robo the option to jump, which helped to avoid grenades. It does play well, but has some frustrating moments when the screen gets a little crowded with enemies, but a fine conversion. RoboCop is best avoided on the Apple II and IBM PC, as they are awful ports of the game. The C64 version is worth a go if you play the version that was fixed, so avoid the original tape game. But all the others have a certain level of appeal. The ZX Spectrum and Amstrad releases do a great job of capturing the spirit of the movie. With the added extra details to the level design and adding the minigames was a good move to follow the beats of the film. The Amiga and Atari St versions are perfectly fine, especially if you loved the arcade. Data East coin-op is certainly the most eye-catching, but it is a coin muncher, and the further you progress the level design deviates a lot from the look of the film as Data East gets a bit too creative. From what we'll see throughout this video, the early titles based on the first film are for the most part very successful adaptations. There are more good conversions than bad.
Jane, let's step outside.
You! Get out of here! You're obsolete!
Take it over, creep.
1990 was a great year for sequels at the cinema, with Predator 2, Back to the Future 3 and Die Hard 2. Orion Pictures seeing big money in the RoboCop franchise, a sequel was inevitable. The movie has Robo dealing with a new drug called Nuke, and OCP introduce a new RoboCop to replace him. The film would end up having a troubled production with many rewrites, and the end results were less than impressive compared to the first. Despite the glowing reviews for its visual effects, the film left a bad taste in the mouths of critics, and it didn't light up the box office. Ocean Software went straight into production when RoboCop 2 was being made, to tie in with the release of the film. Instead of Data East getting a head start, Ocean Software would be the first to release the game. Two developers would handle the ports of RoboCop 2, with Special Effects handling the coding for the Amiga, Atari St, Spectrum 128K, and the new console from Amstrad, the GX4000. Ocean Software were intrigued by this new console, and they scrapped plans for a port to the Amstrad CPC, and instead focused on the GX4000. The Amstrad console turned out to be a massive dud. As a result of dated hardware, it sold terribly on release. The second developer was Painting by Numbers, who would handle the ports to the C64, NES and Game Boy. Data East would again produce an arcade game and publish the NES version. Programming of the Amiga version began months before the film's release. As a guide, the Special Effects development team was given a pre-release version of the film that excluded several scenes. The team was also given a preliminary script of the film and pictures of the characters. The game would follow in the footsteps of the previous RoboCop game, throwing in mini-games that would work as a way to restore Alex Murphy's memory. A shooting gallery was also incorporated as the programmers were enjoying playing Duck Hunt at the time, and thought it would be a great idea to have a similar section. The shooting range levels weren't mandatory, however, and only appeared if the player failed to arrest a number of criminals and confiscate a certain amount of the drug Nuke in the core levels. The famous cop would also take advantage of a hoverpad in the Amiga game, which the programmers thought would be a cool idea, but it just feels out of place and is a nightmare to control, causing frustration from the first level. The painting by numbers versions would be a lot more platform centric, with the graphics appearing more kid friendly, feeling very much like their efforts on Darkman, with wacky level designs appearing radically different to the versions by Special FX. RoboCop is now faster than ever, as he jumps and runs around at top speed, often making it feel like he's walking on ice. These versions would also include mini-games. Reviews at the time were very positive. There was a lot of coverage of RoboCop 2 in the gaming press. The first game was a massive hit, so there was a lot of excitement for the sequel. Once it hit store shelves, it sold very well, but didn't hit the numbers like the original, which would have been a nearly impossible task. The Amiga version received praise for its graphics and sound, but magazines such as The One, CU Amiga and Amiga Format raised the issue of its difficulty and controlling RoboCop, especially when it came to jumping and controlling that blasted hoverpad. But it was noted as being one of the best licensed games of 1990. Your Sinclair considered the game to be better than its predecessor, noting larger levels, greater detailed graphics, and stating that the game was one of the best film conversions Ocean had ever done. The ZX Spectrum version won Best Game overall in the 1990 Crash Readers Awards. The games handled by painting by numbers for the C64, NES and Game Boy fared less well with critics, with most pointing out the cartoony nature of the graphics and the frustration of controlling RoboCop, as you slip and slide all over the place. So what are these ports like of RoboCop 2? The ZX Spectrum version exhibits detailed graphics. They seem to be pushing the old computer to its limits. It does make an effort to include the RoboCop theme tune for the start of the game, but throughout there is no music apart from when you complete a level. It does make use of a few sound effects, but it does fall short when controlling Robo, as he is very slow, and with the enemies charging at you, you have to be quick to react. There are some tricky platforming sections, but the game does offer variety in the gameplay, with added puzzles and a shooting gallery section, a far lengthier game compared to the first one. The port to the GX4000 exhibits nice graphics but strangely has no sound effects throughout, but instead has music, but it lacks the memorable chip tunes of Jonathan Dunn and drops the rendition of the RoboCop movie theme. Oddly, there is a lack of villains to shoot, as you spend most of the time avoiding traps. Again, they make use of minigames throughout. When you face up against Kane, he is 3 times as large as you, making him stupidly massive. The Atari St version would share the same elements as a GX4000 release, but with stronger visuals, but again has no sound effects. The Amiga version would be the most visually impressive, with large sprites, detailed animation, unique level designs, big explosive sound effects, though it would feature no music throughout the main core levels. I found this game to be tough due to the stupid hoverpad. Kane, i.e. RoboCop 2, thankfully is a suitable size once you face up against him, though he is painted gold. The C64 would have a cool looking title screen with nice images for the cutscenes between levels. As mentioned earlier, it will take on a more kid-friendly look with blocky graphics and colourful levels, with it looking like you've been thrown into some mad funhouse. Controlling Robo at first is annoying, but you do eventually get used to it. If you fail to make enough arrests or confiscate enough nuke, you are sent to the shooting range for recalibration. The NES game would be mostly identical to the C64 version, but with higher resolution graphics and in-game music. For the NES release, if you don't make enough arrests or save enough hostages, you have to repeat the level in some cases, but the shooting range is included and an additional puzzle section. The Game Boy version again follows the look of the C64 release, but has entirely different level designs which aren't as weird and wacky like the C64 and NES counterparts. It has more bosses, basically fighting Ed 209 3 times. Puzzles are also included, and to my surprise, a jetpack, which didn't make an appearance to the third film. The arcade for the sequel by Data East, which would never get released on any home computer or console, would be the last released based on the film and would play a lot differently. Data East went with a side-scrolling beat-em-up approach, with Robo still using his famous Auto 9 and taking out thugs with throws if they get close. The game wouldn't have any puzzle mini-games, but would break up the style of gameplay with shooting sections and getting a chance to ride the motorcycle, which featured during one action sequence in the film. The graphics were detailed and colourful, and the level design felt closer to the movie compared to the home ports that felt a bit muddled with their level designs throughout. The Japanese release did receive an exclusive opening sequence to recap the first movie, as you battle Ed 209 and go up against Dick Jones. The game also offered a 2-player option, but you just end up using a different coloured RoboCop. Surely they should have included Anne Lewis, a failed opportunity there. I didn't really have much fun with the ports to the C64, Game Boy and NES. They are ugly looking games and felt the wrong direction with its gameplay mechanics, but the games handled by special effects are the most impressive for the home releases. They all have their frustrating elements, but for the time they were strong titles and deserved the praise they received. The arcade game is certainly the most fun I had playing of all the RoboCop 2 related games. It captured the look and feel of the movie most successfully.
I promise. All right, Mr. RoboCop. Come and get me.
With Orion Pictures in a state of financial difficulty, they rushed RoboCop 3 very quickly into production once RoboCop 2 was released. RoboCop 3 focused on OCP, who had now merged with a Japanese company as they attempt to empty the streets to build their city of the future. They deploy a Japanese robot to get rid of RoboCop, who has turned against the company due to their private army killing Anne Lewis. The film was intended for a release in 1991, but sat on the shelf for over 2 years, with its eventual release in the summer of 1993. It didn't hit the UK till June of 1994. On release, it was panned by critics and fans due to its forgettable story and tame violence, as it was aimed at a younger audience. Ocean Software had already grabbed the license, but they would later find out the film would be delayed. The delays to the movie itself ultimately affected the release of the games, as they all came out ahead of the film and in some cases by 3 years. The 16-bit computer versions appeared first at the end of 1991, followed by the C64, Spectrum, NES and Super Nintendo version in 1992. The Mega Drive, Game Gear and Master System versions would arrive the following year. The Amiga, Atari St and IBM PC game was developed by Digital Image Design, which began working on the game in September of 1990. The developers used a modified version of the 3D game engine previously used on F-29 Retaliator. Orion Pictures initially kept most of the film's story's details secretive, so the team had to proceed using guesswork, which ultimately resulted in some mistakes. Someone thought RoboCop was going to ride a gyrocycle. The team spent ages thinking about RoboCop racing about on a bike, only later to find out it was a jetpack, so a load of work wasted. The team had only filmed stills as a visual reference during development. The game could be played in one of two ways: movie adventure, which allowed you to play the levels in any order, but the outcome of a mission would affect the others. Arcade action just allowed you to play the missions in any order. The game would have detailed images to break up the 3D graphics with mission briefings with the likes of media break or characters in the story. It featured at the time groundbreaking first-person perspective levels, with RoboCop clearing terrorists from an office building and then takes on the splatterpunks in the slums, avoiding any civilians. The third mission sees RoboCop driving around, trying to stop carjackers. The fourth level sees RoboCop using his jetpack, and finally there's a beat-em-up section where he takes on the robot ninja. Apparently the Atari St version ran smoother compared to the Amiga, but the DOS port, which arrived in 1992, would surpass both with more detailed graphics and an improved frame rate. An issue with the Amiga release was the decision to include a security dongle to help combat piracy. This small piece of electronics plugged into one of the Amiga's 2 joystick ports, and the game checked it was there before running, but the game was cracked and spread by pirates a week before its official release. This security idea was swiftly abandoned for future games. The NES Spectrum and Commodore 64 versions were handled by Pro Software, which would feature the amazing music by Jerome Tell. The Speccy and C64 versions open with a shooting gallery as you take out the splatterpunks. Between each level you get a chance to repair RoboCop depending on how many tokens you've collected, though RoboCop on the Speccy does look like he's sitting on the toilet. Level 2 saw RoboCop searching a rocket engine factory, avoiding acid baths and using conveyor belts to navigate your way through to the end to fight the ninja. In Level 3, Robo then puts on a jetpack and takes on a large tank. Level 4 you walk back to the OCP tower, coming up against Ed 209. The final boss sees RoboCop climb the tower, taking on the Robo Ninjas. The Commodore version would be more visually appealing compared to the Spectrum, which again had limited colours and some dithering problems with its scrolling. The sprites on the C64 would be smaller to offer a larger playing field. Both versions would have music and sound effects throughout the game. The C64 would be the winner in this department. The NES version would have similar levels but drops the shooting gallery for the first stage. They include more of the story with additional cutscenes. The platforming would be more precise and felt less of a struggle compared to the other 8-bit counterparts. A small team at Ocean Software would handle RoboCop 3 on the newly released Super Nintendo. They had no experience with the console, and they weren't that invested in producing RoboCop 3, especially when they had no arcade game to copy. They were given limited resources from Orion, no full script, just a synopsis and a breakdown of the story, which could guide them on the locations to make for levels in the game, so a lot of guesswork had to be made to complete it. The Super Nintendo game would follow in the footsteps of Ocean's previous Robo titles, with the basic walking along shooting bad guys. As the early games would break up the gameplay with many puzzles, this drops that and instead has RoboCop using his flight pack, making use of the Mode 7 scaling. The lead coder on this game was a hardcore player and liked games that were difficult. The game's testers at Ocean struggled to get past the first level, but one of the team members managed to successfully complete it, so the tough difficulty would remain. The Mega Drive port was released in late 1993 and was handled by Flying Edge, who would also produce the Master System and Game Gear ports. These would be just straight conversions of the SNES title. But the programmers did make some attempts to address the difficulty that plagued the Super Nintendo game. When you die, you're not thrown right back to the start of the level, but instead they throw in checkpoints to make it more bearable. The game offered options to increase your lives and continues, plus you could adjust the difficulty. They threw in some voice samples of RoboCop when you complete a level, though it does sound really crap.
Thank you for your cooperation.
And when it came to the flight pack levels, there was no use of the scaling, so you can't fly lower to the ground. The Master System and Game Gear versions are basically cut down versions of the Mega Drive release, but do retain the flying sequences to keep variety in the gameplay. Reviews at the time were strong for the 3D version of RoboCop 3, and the 8-bit micro versions were also warmly praised. I think the journalists at the time were still happy to see these old computers, in the case of the Spectrum and C64, still being supported, despite many gamers jumping onto the latest consoles from Sega and Nintendo. The console ports were awarded across the board with negative reviews, with many feeling it was another tied platformer, which they had all seen before. The early SNES titles by Ocean gave the developer a bad reputation in America, as many hadn't experienced their previous games and just summed up the software house on their recent output. Surprisingly, the magazine Mega Action gave the Mega Drive version a glowing review of 91%. No idea what that critic was smoking. So out of all the RoboCop 3 games, the Amiga, Atari St and IBM PC versions are the best looking out of the bunch, an attempt to do something different with the license. At the time the games looked incredible, but are very dated by today's standards, and a somewhat clunky frame rate may put you off going back to it, but it's certainly worth a look. The Spectrum and C64 versions are not bad games and are fun for a quick playthrough. The Spectrum game recently sold for over £300 complete in box. Utter bonkers. For the consoles, I would personally recommend the NES and Mega Drive versions, as the NES game is a fun little platformer, and I really like the added extras of the cutscenes. The Super Nintendo version is tough to play. When games are just so frustrating and unfair, it zaps the fun out of playing it. So the Mega Drive version just takes away some of that frustration. It's a shame at the time for these new consoles, the developers didn't try to offer something more than just recycle what had been done before. 1993 RoboCop fans were treated to a new lackluster movie on the big screen. A new TV series was in the works for release the following year. A new range of toys had been produced and RoboCop would battle the Terminator in a new series of comics. The story of RoboCop vs. the Terminator was published by Dark Horse Comics as a 4-part series in 1992. Created by writer Frank Miller and artist Walter Simonson. The brief series involved a time-twisting plot, drawing Officer Alex Murphy into the complex and grim realms of the Terminators and the Resistance fighters who are bravely trying to end their reign of terror. Virgin Games snapped up the license for a whopping $2 million, with the intentions to release a game on all the gaming consoles and handheld devices. Virgin already had experience with the Terminator IP, having produced the Terminator on the Mega Drive and the enhanced version on the Mega CD, with both versions getting strong reviews, so Virgin had a good reputation dealing with licensed properties. They hired Interplay to produce the Super Nintendo and Game Boy versions. An NES game was also produced but was cancelled, despite being nearly complete. Virgin had intended to release it for the European market, but decided against it, as many publishers were moving away from the NES come 1993. The game would eventually be leaked online years later, and is perfectly playable, but does exhibit a number of bugs. Virgin would develop the Sega games in-house. In an interview with magazine Retro Gamer, the developers said they were unable to use material from the comics, including its direct plot. But this may only be for the Mega Drive release. The SNES game would appear to take images from the comics to play out the story in cutscenes. The Sega version would only make use of some crawling text, and that was about it. The Mega Drive version would be the first to be developed, and Interplay would take inspiration from the Sega title for their SNES conversion and make use of the console's extra capabilities such as Mode 7. The programmers and designers for the Mega Drive game would sit up at night analysing Contra 3 The Alien Wars, one of their favourite games. They wanted to figure out what was it that made the game so addictive. In order to save time and money, RoboCop vs. the Terminator utilised Dave Perry's Mega Drive game engine, most recently seen in Cool Spot and Global Gladiators. Their designers upped the gore and violence to levels rarely seen on Sega's Mega Drive. They wanted as much gore and blood as possible. This was around the time Mortal Kombat was coming out, so violence in games was becoming all the rage to appeal to teenagers and adult gamers alike. As Nintendo was trying to avoid any violence in their games, the SNES version would have the blood and gore removed to be more kid-friendly. When it was released, the reviews were generally very positive for the 16-bit versions. The Mega Drive release was the one everyone raved about thanks to its slick animation, addictive gameplay, the level of violence and strong music. It was criticised, however, for being too tough, but it made up for the sloppy efforts on RoboCop 3. Many journalists were a bit disappointed you couldn't control the Terminator. The SNES version didn't receive as much fanfare. Going through a lot of the gaming magazines from the UK and the USA, there didn't appear to be much hype for the game. Just a little bit of coverage before its general release, and most of the focus was on the Sega version once the gaming press got their hands on it. Superplay magazine awarded the game 27%, but Computer and Video Games magazine gave it over 80%, so the SNES game had its fans and haters. The SNES port looked detailed in areas, but lacks the speed and violence of the Sega version. RoboCop doesn't look as slick, the sound is forgettable, often muffled, and RoboCop just feels sluggish to control. It does, however, feature better level design on the later stages, feeling more in line with the comics. The end boss, you actually get to fight something interesting. The Sega version features an underwhelming battle with a giant T-800 head. It does include a driving section making use of the Mode 7 features, which does offer some variety in the gameplay, but really isn't needed. The 8-bit Sega versions for the Master System and Game Gear would be scaled-back versions of their superior brother, the Mega Drive. Despite the drop in quality of the graphics and sound, the gameplay pretty much remained intact, though it does exhibit excessive slowdown in areas. Interplay's port for the Nintendo Game Boy would be the weakest of all the releases, with poor sprites and animation, and it is overall an ugly looking game. It does make attempts to show Skynet this time as a giant floating brain, but it's not really worth your time playing. When it comes to RoboCop vs. the Terminator, it's all about the Mega Drive game. The SNES one has some interesting elements, but Nintendo just can't compete with Sega this time round. During a time when Mortal Kombat and graphic violence was all the rage, kids loved the R-rated nature of the Sega game. But it was very difficult, almost becoming impossible once you reached the later levels. The boss fights were torturous if you lost your power weapon and had to make do with Robo's Auto 9. But despite that, the game is a lot of fun to play, just ploughing through enemies watching their bodies explode into gallons of blood.
Excellent.
After RoboCop vs. the Terminator, the famous cyborg disappeared from gaming for a while. There was a game in development for the PlayStation that never stepped beyond its prototype phase. In June of 1999, however, Titus secured the license to produce a RoboCop game for a number of gaming platforms for the PS2, Xbox, GameCube, PC, Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance. Titus didn't have a good reputation amongst gamers and the gaming press as a developer, with many turkeys under their belt, with terrible games based on licenses such as Dick Tracy, the Blues Brothers 2000, and of course the infamous Superman 64. In 2001 they released the Game Boy Color version, with the Game Boy Advance release intended for the following year, but it was eventually cancelled. The Game Boy Color game consists of 8 levels. You start off before all missions in the police headquarters, which is displayed as a still image, where you move a cursor around. You have the option of checking for messages or emails, visiting the lab for upgrades, or visit Lewis in her office. The graphics for these sections look very nice, but once you begin your mission, it goes to a top-down view, and the graphics take a massive dive. But don't let that put you off, as it's surprisingly very playable. You see RoboCop lock onto civilians to avoid shooting them, and you take out gang members walking around armed with guns or swords. You have simple objectives of collecting evidence and getting the usual energy and weapon pickups. It has nice music throughout, and if you liked Alien 3 on the Game Boy, or even something like Alien Breed on the Amiga, I think you'll get some fun out of this. A genuine good game from Titus. In May of 2002, the PS2 version remained in development and was known as RoboCop: The Future of Law Enforcement, with an expected release date that October, and an Xbox version was also announced for April of 2003. However, the game continued to be delayed. Rumours had circulated that Titus owed MGM additional money for the RoboCop licence, so many felt it would be cancelled, but the developer must have managed to sort out their debts, and it came out in November of that year on the PS2 in the UK and Japan. The Xbox version would follow in March 2004 for the US and Europe. It would eventually arrive on the GameCube, though only released in Japan, and a PC version was released exclusively in Germany of that year. For the game's story, RoboCop is tasked with finding the people responsible for the spread of a new designer drug known as brain drain and their connections to OCP. There are 9 basic missions in the game, each with multiple sections. Each mission has one primary objective, with additional bonus ones such as saving hostages and arresting criminals. Despite a long development, it's a buggy mess, with poor collision detection, character models clipping through walls, weak sound mixing. You can't save during the missions, it only saves once the level is complete, increasing the game's difficulty, plus the missions are long. RoboCop walks at the speed of an old-aged pensioner, making the whole process of playing the game a chore. Ammo can be sparse, making it tough to battle the end bosses that require a lot of damage to be destroyed. Upon release, the game was obviously panned across the board, despite looking promising from the screenshots in magazines, making use of RoboCop's targeting system, appearing to be a faithful adaptation of the movie, but playing it left a lot to be desired. GameSpot awarded it 2.2 out of 10, saying it had a bevy of horrible problems that rendered the game practically unplayable. Official Xbox magazine criticised the game as repetitive and frustrating, and noted the limited weapons and their ineffectiveness against enemies. Electronic Gaming Monthly followed suit, criticising its graphics, repetitive mission objectives, and poor AI. I recall being quite excited about it coming out. A RoboCop FPS game seemed very enticing, but once I played it on the Xbox, I was deeply disappointed. The points raised by the gaming journalists at the time were spot on. It's not a fun game by any means. Frustrating targeting system, you lock onto an enemy but sometimes you don't hit them, you can't jump, you move slowly, making it tough to avoid explosions or random ambushes by the villains, the levels are bland and forgettable, and the music was just irritating. For a game that spent a lot of time in development, it still felt rushed. Not worth your time even if you are a hardcore fan of RoboCop. RoboCop has been pretty lucky over the years, with many enjoyable games very much like Batman, but RoboCop has faltered with his appearance on more modern consoles. The old days of the 8-bit and 16-bit computers, he found success, but those days are long gone. It's a shame the 2003 game was such a turd, as the FPS genre would suit the character. I think perhaps a game in the style of Gears of War would be a nice direction, because it's cool to see the whole character of RoboCop on screen. Alex Murphy has made other appearances on mobile devices with a game from 2004, and that same year a fan even made their own game, taking inspiration from the ocean titles of the 80s, called RoboCop 2D, which is definitely worth seeking out. More recently, you could play as RoboCop in Mortal Kombat 11, with Peter Weller returning to provide his voice for the character that made him a superstar. RoboCop is a product of the 1980s, and experiencing games based on the famous cop of Detroit, it's best to look to the past for your fix. With many good choices, for me the ZX Spectrum version of RoboCop 1 is recommended. The arcade for the sequel, and RoboCop vs Terminator on the Mega Drive should give you the nostalgic hit you need, plus the added excitement of taking down your enemies with some explosive firepower.
Come quietly or there will be trouble.
20 seconds to comply.
RoboCop. Who is he? What is he? Where does he come from?
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
RoboCop.